that's a sign this was all from God. And to further mollify the God of Israel, we better add an offering. How are we going to, what kind of offering can we offer? And you may remember they said, look, there are 5 main cities in Philistia, Gath and Ekron and Azza. So anyway, they said, let's offer 5 statues, 5 gold statues of hemorrhoids. And we showed what that really would look like, and 5 golden mice. And I didn't show you what that might look like. And I was thinking, what would it look like? 5 separate statues of golden mice. And I don't know if this is what they sent, but this is what struck me. I don't think this is what they sent, because I don't think the people of the Philistines celebrated by what are you going to do now that you got rid of the Ark of the Covenant? I'm going to Disneyland. But anyway, I couldn't resist. Okay, so we continue. As we go into chapter, I mean, it's a different kind of Bible class, but it's absolutely accurate, and you learn the real stuff in between the stuff. So here we go. Chapter 7 is where we left off. Vayavo Anshe Kiryat Ya'arim, the city of Kiryat Ya'arim, a Jewish city now. Now it's in Jewish custody. And they now have the ark. Vaya'alu et Aron Hashem vayavivoto el Beit Avinadav Bagiv'ah. Now, when it first arrived at Bet Shemesh, you remember at the end of chapter 6, the Jews celebrated a bit too irreverently. And while they were thrilled, and legitimately so, that the ark was now in Jewish hands, restored from Philistine custody, they got silly, and they started looking inside the ark, which was forbidden. It's too awesome and holy, and they weren't allowed to look inside. And the city was smitten with their own plague. And they realized we're not worthy of holding on to it. We've got to give it to another city. And the people in Kiryat Ya'arim treated the ark with extraordinary dignity and honor. And as a result, they actually were blessed uniquely for 20 years. So it went to Beit Avinadav Bagivah, and someone had to take custody. You couldn't just leave it out in the open. There's rain every year during the rainy season. It would be, you didn't want to do that. So someone named Avinadav, who lived in that area, and Elazar beno Kichu, Lishmor et Aron Hashem, he and his son Elazar undertook to guard and honor and sanctify that ark. And it remained in their custody, Vayehi. Miyom shevet ha'aron b'kiryat Ya'arim, vayirbu hayamim vayu eshvim shana. That ark remained in their custody in the city of Kiryat Ya'arim for 20 years. And here we've been learning in the last 2-3 chapters about all the cities where the ark was placed, having plagues and horrific plagues and mass deaths. But where it was in Jewish custody and treated with the appropriate respect and honor, dignity and awe, the city actually, Vayinahu kol Beit Yisrael acharei Hashem, the people benefited for 20 years with extra blessings, and they followed God. Vayomer Shmuel Aleph kol Beit Yisrael lemor. And the prophet Samuel, by now he's the leader of the Jewish people. He's not a king. There is no king. We're being led by a prophet. Do you need a king? Do you need a president? Do you need a head of state, a head of government? It's an interesting question. In our minds, you must have a head of government. By the way, there's a difference between head of government and head of state. The Queen of England, or now the King, they're known as the head of state. It's a ceremonial thing. That kind of person does not make decisions to rule the country. The person rather is a figurehead who kind of speaks up as a kind of moderating. He or she takes positions that everybody in the country could agree on. So they stay away from controversy. And in the face of controversy, there's at least that figurehead that everybody can say this person is England, or other countries that have a head of state. We don't. We only had for us, the head of government is also the head of state, president of the United States. But in many countries, they have like a president or a king who's the head of state, and then they have somebody else like a prime minister who's the head of government. Okay, so with the Jews, Shmuel was effectively the head of state and the head of government. He was the figurehead, so to speak, not far more than the figurehead. But on the one hand, he was the kind of unifying symbol that everybody could stand behind. Everybody could stand behind Shmuel, Samuel the prophet. And to the degree that decisions had to be made, he would be the one. But usually he was not necessarily. There's a lot of things you can get done without a head of government, if people are working together. And so Jews did not at that time have a head of government per se. And you'll see the reason I'm taking out time to talk about that is it becomes a theme very soon. It's going to be a theme at the heart of chapter 8 and the end of 7. Okay, particularly chapter 8. Vayom Shmuel kol beit Yisrael lemor. So Shmuel says to all the people as follows: In b'chol avavchem atem shavim el Hashem. You know, you as a nation whom I lead have not been as uniformly righteous as you should be, as you should have been. That's why there have been deaths. The war with the Philistines, where many died. The situation in Beit Shemesh when the ark was returned. If you, the nation, will with all your hearts return to God. Shavim, shav means to return. Baal teshuvah, about shuva. Teshuvah is to return to God. Hasiru et Elohei hanechar mitochachem v'ha'ashtarot. If you want to really return to God, there are some among you who still have little statues and idols, and you have to get rid of them. The people in that time, people believed in statues, and they really, had statues with them, little statues and large ones. We just learned about Dagon, the statue god of the Philistines. They had that all over Egypt, and they had it all over the Middle East. You've got to get rid of, and there were some Jews that had it. Even though they believed in God, they were sort of polytheistic. Not the majority, by far not, but small enough numbers that they were there. And he said, you've got to get rid of them, and you've got to stop with the Ashtarot. Ashtarot are tree goddesses, people who worshipped certain trees. And you have to turn your hearts to God Almighty and serve only Him. And if you'll do that, God then will protect you from the Philistines, because there have been a few wars with the Philistines and they have not worked out well. The god in the Middle East of the Philistines, one of the major gods, was known as Baal, B-A-A-L. Plural would be Baalim. That name crops up throughout Tanakh, throughout these books of prophets. It was the god of the Philistines. So some of the Jews had these little gods. I have unfortunately met Jews in my life who've made lighthearted comments about how, they'll pray to every god. Let's say there's an illness, or let's say there's whatever it is that they're praying for, money, I don't know what. And it's like, someone will say, I'll pray to this God for you. This is my religion. And they'll say, I'll take all the gods I can get. And actually in Judaism, that's forbidden. There's only one God. And when a Jewish person says, I'll take all the gods I can get, they think they're being funny. They're saying it's lighthearted. It's collegial and friendly to someone who's actually, it's counterproductive, because the God to whom we're praying, the attitude is, if you want to pray to a lot of gods, okay, I'll step aside, so to speak. I'll focus on those who are praying to me, and you could be in the hands of the other gods that you're praying to. And so it's a very severe issue, actually. It's important, since the opportunity arises, to bring it up here. Consequently, here what he's saying is, it's not enough to pray to God of Israel and also to have the Baal and also to have Ashtaroth. It's one God, and you've got to get rid of those other gods. And so they did. And then he says, Vayavdu et Hashem levado, and you'll have to pray to the Lord alone. And when they did that, Vayom Shmuel kivtzu et kol Yisrael mitzpata, bring all the Jews to Mitzpah. Mitzpah was his base, was a religious center. And so obviously not every Jew in the whole country could go there, but it's like sometimes in the United States, people gather in Washington, D.C. Sometimes they gather in, I don't know, New York City or whatever, but more probably Washington, D.C. Catholics gather at the Vatican, just as I'm thinking offhand of another place. Modern day Jews gather in Jerusalem. Modern day Muslims gather in Mecca in Saudi Arabia. Okay, gather at Mitzpah. Ve'etpalel ba'adchem el Hashem, and I will pray to God on behalf of the Jewish nation in terms of the problems we're having and the persecutions and the conflicts we're having with the Philistines. And now I can do so on behalf of the nation because I know the nation is pure. And I know you have rid yourselves of these Baal idols and these Ashtaroth tree goddesses. So the nation, not everybody, but a huge gathering assembled at Mitzpah, where they ritually poured certain water libations, and there was a national fast, like on Yom Kippur, in trying to pray to God. The purpose of a Jewish fast is not the fast, but what the fast does. Many Jewish people make the mistake of thinking, I'm fasting on Yom Kippur, on Tisha B'Av, whatever. And they spend the day watching comedy shows on TV, or kibitzing, joking around, or following the stock market, or following the latest news, or talking fashion. That's not what a fast day is. A fast day is a day of solemnity, really focusing on God and on our own mortality. The idea, like on Yom Kippur, that we're praying to God for life because life could end tomorrow. And for some people it does. Every day in the news, there are no shortage of stories in the local news in all the major cities of someone who left the house that morning and never made it home at night. Every local TV station begins its local news. I haven't watched local news for years, but as I recall, whether it was the local channel 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, every local news report to grab your attention and keep you watching at least to the first commercial starts with a local murder. And it's every day. You just look at crime statistics. And then there are other things besides that. People in Turkey, one day they're walking down the street. Next thing you know, a building drops on their heads. Happened in Florida. People in Japan one day got hit by a tidal wave of a tsunami. You never know. You never know. And so a Jewish fast is to impress on us that it's not just theoretical, like what I just said now in class about how a person could die any day. When you're fasting for 25 hours, and a Jewish fast is not only no food, but no water. You're not allowed to drink a thing. And that surprises people. When people hear about fasting, non-Jews, when they talk about fasting, it goes without saying that they're going to be drinking. I remember members of the Irish Republican Army there was a period of time that they were having part of their political protest against the British. Their prisoners were fasting to the death. And the British attitude was, go ahead, makes it easier for us. But the idea was it'll arouse world sympathy. And I remember as a kid, young man, reading about it And I was thinking they're going to die like in 2-3 days. And each of these people fasted to the death, and they died like 50 days later. I remember it would be 7-8 weeks till they died. I remember thinking, how in the world can you have 8 weeks of a fast, and how could you live that long? And then I found out they drink juice, they drink stuff. So in a Jewish fast, you can't even drink water. And so what happens by the later part of the 25 hours, you start feeling mortality. You really feel that you started, let's say you were really healthy and robust at the beginning of the fast, and you know, it's like any other day, and you know, theoretically, a person could die, and by the end of the day, you realize, you know, one of these days, they might ring the bell for me too. And that's the idea of a Jewish fast. So it's not a time to joke, or to follow sports, or to watch TV, movies, except for solemn movies. If you're watching stuff that's solemn, and that adds to your appreciation of the solemnity, okay, that's a different story. So we continue. So they fasted, because it's not enough just to have the holy man pray for you. That's not Jewish. There's a terrible misconception some people have in the Jewish community: get the rabbi to say a prayer for me, or get the prophet to say a prayer for me, and all is well. Really, the prophet or the rabbi, even if he recites a prayer, it's on the individual who is seeking whatever it is they're seeking from that prayer. They have to make the effort. And it's not as much to have the rabbi or the prophet recite the prayer. So you see here, the nation asks Shmuel to recite the prayer, and he recites the prayer, but they also fast. So they have to do it too. So on the one hand, ve'etpalel ba'adchem, I will pray for you. But on the other hand, vayatsumu bayomahu, and they fasted on that day. Vayomru sham chatanu l'Hashem, and they confessed to God their sins. In Judaism, we do not have an intermediary to whom we confess. Like, let's say in Catholicism, where there's a confessional at the cathedral, and someone confesses maybe to the priest. In Judaism, there is no confession, let's say, to the rabbi. That would be a misconception, someone who wanted to do that. One confesses directly to God. That's what we say on Yom Kippur. Chatanu, we have sinned. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu, divarnu dofi. The famous prayer which we beat our hearts in sorrow for the sins we've committed. We confess to God. Chatanu l'Hashem. Vayishmot Shmuel b'nei Israel b'mitzpah. And Shmuel, in addition to being the prophet, served as the judge and the leader, the chieftain of the Israelites, based in Mitzpah. Okay. Vayishma'u plishtim ki hitkapsu b'nei Israel hamitzpata. When the Philistines heard that there's some mega mass Jewish gathering at Mitzpah, they didn't know all the details. In those days, they did not have television news, internet, Facebook, Twitter. They didn't have access exactly to what's going on. But when there's a massive thing going on somewhere, the word gets out. And the idea that their next door neighbor country to the Philistine country, the people of Israel, were having some kind of extraordinary mass gathering in Mitzpah, concerned the Philistines gravely, and they decided they better do something. They're going to go to war. Vaya'alu sarnei plishtim al Yisrael, vayishmu b'nei Yisrael, vayir'u mipnei plishtim. And the leaders of the Philistines gathered a huge army with the intention of, let's have it out now. Let's just go one-on-one right now. And the Jews actually were quite afraid. Vayomru b'nei Israel, and by the way, it's interesting. What is the mindset of the modern-day Jew in Israel in the face of Iran constantly talking about, we're going to develop nuclear weapons and we're going to wipe Israel off the face of the earth? And it's a very, very interesting thing. In 1948, when Israel was founded as a country, and 7 Arab armies gathered, Lebanon and Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq. I mean, these countries gathered. What's the psychology that you have being invaded by 7 armies? And you are a small little itsy bitsy country the size of New Jersey. It's what it is, size of New Jersey. And we actually have a population the size of New Jersey, and they're the size of Delaware. And they're barely an army made up of recent Holocaust survivors. It was 1948. What's the mindset? The mindset is ein berera. That's actually an expression in Israel and Hebrew. The mindset is I have no choice. What are we going to do? If we stop and think about it, there's no way we're going to win. We're going to get clobbered. We're going to get massacred. But what's the alternative? If we don't fight, we're going to get massacred also. So we fight. And they won. And then there was the 56 and 67 war. And during the 6-Day War, that was a turning point. They really thought once again they might be driven into the Mediterranean Sea. That was what Gamal Abdel Nasser said he was going to do. I'll drive you well into the sea, the Mediterranean. And Syria joined and Jordan joined. There were 3 fronts, all of Israel's fronts were under attack. What do you do? And by God's miracle, Israel not only won the war, but did so in 6 days. The United States was fighting in Vietnam from like 1958 or so, Eisenhower's years, through the Kennedy years, through the Johnson years, till Nixon took us out. So we were in Vietnam in a war for about 10 years, the great mighty United States against a small Vietnam. And it was sort of same thing with the United States in Korea. And there were the Jews in 6 days, wiped out 3 Arab armies. So it was a miracle. So there's been an extraordinary change in the mindset in Israel, a sense of, in the face of, let's say, Iran. Number one, what are we going to do? I mean, everybody's not going to evacuate the country. Quite the contrary, people are moving in. France, Jews are fleeing from France, moving to Israel. Jews from Ukraine and Russia, clearing out, moving to Israel. And there's a sense of a contemporary Israel ready to take this on if, God forbid, it comes, because there's no choice. And so we look in this context at what's going on in chapter 7 of Shmuel, that the Plishtim, the Philistines, are coming. Vayamru v'nei Yisrael Shmuel al tacharesh mimenu miza'ok el Hashem Elokeinu v'yoshienu miyad Plishtim. The Jews say to Samuel, please, this is totally not the time to back away. You've just prayed to God. We've just fasted as a nation. And please don't back off. Please continue the prayers. Please continue crying out to God that he should save us from these Philistines. And it then describes, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, that Samuel, Shmuel, offers a sacrifice to God. Thereupon Shmuel took a suckling lamb, sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord in behalf of Israel. Vayazak Shmuel Hashem b'yad Yisrael v'yaneu Hashem. Samuel cried to God on behalf of the Jews, and God answered him affirmatively. And Shmuel was presenting the burnt offering. Uplishtim nikshu lemilchama b'Yisrael, and the Philistines now invaded and commenced the war against the Jews. Vayar'im Hashem b'kol gadol b'yomahu al plishtim. And by miracle of God, there was an indescribable thundering. Vayar'im ra'am, there was a thundering. The sound, it can't be described. You've heard the worst thunderclaps on certain occasions of terrible thunderstorms. Maybe you even remember being scared as a child, having been at home and hiding under a blanket as a terrible thunderstorm was going on. This was a biblical thunderstorm. It's hard exactly to describe how intense this was. What comes to mind as I think about it is something like the environment at the time of the giving of the Torah, the 10 commandments or the 10 pronouncements, that as God gave at Mount Sinai the Ten Commandments or the 10 pronouncements, as God came down in this chapter 19 of Shmot, the book of Exodus, Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai, and God came down on Mount Sinai, El Rosh Har, on that day, Vayehi kol hashofar holech v'chazek ma'od. There was an extraordinary noise, an extraordinary sound of a shofar, like a ram's horn, that was coming from nowhere. No one knew where it was coming from. And it was louder and louder and louder, and it was terrifying. As the people were listening to this extraordinary noise, it terrified them. And that's already 21. So as they received the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 commandments or the 10 pronouncements, they heard this extraordinary noise. Once again, in chapter 20, verse 14, not only chapter 19, the entire nation amid the 10 commandments, the 10 pronouncements, saw the sound. It's hard to see sound. It was miraculous. And the fire, and kol shofar, the sound of the shofar. And they were terrified. And by the way, that's not the only situation where the miracle of God's thunder overwhelmed a people. You have the same phenomenon took place with the what was it, the 9th, the 8th, the 7th plague. 7th plague of Barad, of hailstones. So we know that among the 10 plagues, there came the plague of hailstones. And during the hailstones, they came down as fiery hailstones. And part of the miracle was that they were coming down, that it came down as ice with fire in the ice. The hail balls, part of the miracle of it was not only the devastation that they caused in and of themselves, but the idea that it wasn't just a weather phenomenon, but it was actually ice balls filled with fire, which are kind of impossible. And it sent the message that this is something divine. It's impossible to understand. And most people focus on the aspect of it being hail, that I will cause, God said, a very grievous hail, such as never been in Egypt since the day it was founded and to this day. But the interesting thing about the hail, while most people remember the hail and the movie, The 10 Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, he actually depicts his version of it, Barad Kaved Ma'od, an extraordinarily heavy hailstorm. But what really drove the Pharaoh crazy, more than the hail, V'yehi Barad b'chol Arutz Mitzrayim, and there was hail in all the land of Egypt, was the noise, the sound of the hail coming down. V'Hashem natan kolot uvarad, that God sent thunder and hail, and it was a terrible thunder. On the one hand, Vayamtir Hashem barad. On the one hand, the Lord caused hail to fall upon Egypt, a fiery hail, fire and flashing amidst the hail. But the Pharaoh, when he asked Moses, please stop this, please ask God to stop the hail, he said, Ha'atiru el Hashem, v'rav miyot kolot Elokimu barad, entreat the Lord and let there be an end to these mighty thunderings. The thunderings were what drove him crazy. It drove the country crazy. And God said, and Moshe said, I'll go out, I'll raise my hands to God, hakolot yachdalun, v'habarad lo ya'od. And Moshe said, I'll spread forth my hands that the thunder should cease. So I want you to have that sense of biblical thunder. It's not like thunder, it's thunder, of a biblical sort that would drive the Pharaoh to say, I'll let the people go, that would have accompanied the giving of the 10 pronouncements at Mount Sinai. And so what happened here, Shmuel the prophet, he prays to God, the nation fasts, he prays additionally, he offers sacrifices, the Philistines attack, by our aim Hashem b'kol gadol bayomahu al plishtim. And on that day, God smites them with an enormous coal, an enormous voice, an enormous thunder sound, thundered mightily. And again, by thunder, it's something we cannot, in our own minds, even if we try to imagine, based on the heaviest thunder we ever heard, that shook our homes. It's nothing like a biblical thunder that I just shared with you from the plague of hail or from the giving of the 10 pronouncements. Al plishtim, and these thunderclaps exploded in the Philistines' ears, vayuhumeim, and it drove them crazy. It completely disconcerted them and drove them into confusion. It drove them nuts. You can't fight. If someone is really, really, really pounding let's say a smartphone is playing music, or let's say even more so a TV or some kind of a sound box, or let's say at a concert, but even more so, and they turn it up to the maximum, it like practically blows your ears out. And you can't fight a war in those circumstances. Could drive you crazy. Vayinagfu lifnei Yisrael, and the Philistines sustained a terrible plague of destruction at the hands of the Jews. Vayitzeu anshe Yisrael min ha-mitzpah, vayirdafu et plishtim, and the Jews went from Mitzpah, that center where they all had gathered to be with Shmuel while he prayed to God, and they pursued the Philistines in battle. Vayakum ad mitachat leveit kar, and they basically wiped them out. Vaikach Shmuel even achat vayasem bein ha-mitzpah ben Hashem, vaikrat shma even ha-ezer, vayomar adhena azaranu Hashem. And Shmuel established a monument. In those days, it was a thing. Now it's very interesting. We are living in a time, I don't want to get political, of course, in our classes. I don't do that in our Bible or Talmud or any of those classes. I might discuss something going on politically, but I don't like to get into politics per se. But we're living in a time in America where they're toppling statues for various reasons. Again, I don't want to get into it and my personal feelings. In Judaism, we don't have that problem to begin with. We don't have the issue to begin with because we're not allowed to make statues of people. So you're not allowed to make a statue of a George Washington or Abraham Lincoln in the first place, or Thomas Jefferson or Theodore Roosevelt or a Civil War general, and just go on and on. I don't want to get into it. You're not allowed to make a statue of a person. That's from the 10 commandments, the 10 pronouncements. That's the second one. Not allowed to make statues. So what we have in Jewish history is when we do have something as a memorial, in the Bible, you see they establish pillars of heavy boulders, not just a few rocks, but like these boulders you find in vast open areas, and they build monuments. Those become monuments, and they also last forever, because unlike wood or something like that, boulders stay forever. And there are monuments like that. And that's how it's done in Judaism. So Samuel, in this case, we learned the other day, I was teaching about Bet El on Sunday, and Yaakov, Jacob, our patriarch, in the city of Bethel, established 12 pillars in parallel to the 12 tribes of Israel. So here, Shmuel establishes likewise a pillar. Vayikanu ha-plishtim v'lo yasvu od lavo bagvul Yisrael. The Philistines were so destroyed in battle, and that battle, that they were essentially neutralized as a military and never bothered Israel again for the duration of the life of Samuel. In a way, I don't know what the future holds. None of us does. But Egypt went to war against Israel once, twice, three. Egypt doesn't go to war anymore against Israel. What the future holds, God forbid, I don't know. But Egypt and Jordan made war on Israel in 1948. They were sure they were going to wipe out Israel. And Israel really whooped them. And in 1967, they made war again, 56 also. And they thought they're really going to wipe out Israel. Again, three fronts, that's all Israel has. Israel has four sides. One side is the Mediterranean. So from the north, Syria attacked, from the south, Egypt attacked, and from the west, from the east, Jordan attacked. All the country was under attack. And Jordan and Egypt expected, together with Syria, they were going to wipe out Israel. And it ended up, Israel not only was able to defend against the onslaught, but she turned it around and she moved forward and she liberated Judea and Samaria and the eastern half of the city of Jerusalem from Jordan. Jordan had illegally occupied the so-called West Bank, that's what they called it, for 19 years, from 1948 to 1967, and they lost it. And they're never getting it back again. It's 55 years, and despite all efforts around the world to stop Israel from staying in Judea, Samaria, the so-called West Bank, there are now more than 500,000 Jews living there. It's impossible to give it up. They'll never give it up. There will never be a so-called two-state solution. Now, what happened after 67? After Jordan lost Judea, Samaria, and eastern Jerusalem, they've never made another war. In 1973, during the Yom Kippur War, Jordan stayed out of it. 1982, during the Lebanon War, Jordan stayed out of it. Jordan has not been involved in another war with Israel in the last 55 years, after they used to be involved in one every 5-10 years. So that's what happened to the Philistines. And by the way, with Egypt, in the Yom Kippur War of 73, they were almost completely destroyed. They initially had amazing successes at the early part. They caught Israel in Yom Kippur. But when Israel turned the war around, next thing you knew, Israel had encircled the Egyptian Third Army and was ready to massacre and wipe out their entire army. There would have been nothing stopping Israel from marching straight onto Cairo. And Henry Kissinger flew in at the behest of the president and pretty much pressured Israel to let the Egyptians go back home. And Egypt never made another war either. Again, what the future holds, God forbid. But since then, 73 is 27, it's 50 years. They have not made a war in 50 years. So that gives you an idea what we're talking about with the Philistines. They were so extraordinarily routed and defeated in that war. They never made another war. Here they were fighting wars, and there was wars with the Philistines. And by the way, they're going to make no wars in the future. You can bet Goliath was a Philistine. So in the days of King Saul and King David, they'll be back. They're not leaving the story. But that was the end of them. Vatiyad Hashem b'plishtim kol yemei Shmuel. For the rest of the life of Shmuel, the Philistines left us alone. Vatashovna ha'arim asher lakhu plishtim me'et Yisrael, and all the cities of Israel that the Philistines had seized in previous battles and occupied, all of them were returned. Just like 1967. Just as in the 67 Six-Day War, all the cities of the Jews, that had so many of the cities, were returned. Hebron, Shechem, all of Judea, Samaria, the eastern half of Jerusalem, the Golan. So all the cities that the Philistines had taken from the Jews were returned. Vatashovna, there's that word shov again, return. Vatashovna ha'arim asher lakhu plishtim me'et Yisrael, li Yisrael, me'akron ve'adgat et gevulan hitzil Yisrael me'at plishtim. So that whole area was restored. The towns that the Philistines had taken from Israel, all were restored to Israel. Israel recovered all her territory from the Philistines, just as we see today, Israel in 67 recovering her territory that the Arabs want to get back. They're not getting it back. Vayehi shalom ben Yisrael u'ben ha'emori, and there was peace by the time, one of the nice things when you've routed the enemy that completely is everybody else leaves you alone also. No one messes around. Vayishpot Shmuel et Yisrael kol yemei chayav. And for the rest of his life, Shmuel was the leader. Now, shofet is a judge. Technically, it means he judged. But more than judge, he also was the military leader, not as a general in the army in the front, but he made the call whether to go to battle. And there no longer were any battles. And he set policy and religious law. And the rest of his life, he was unchallenged and universally loved. And in his leadership, the halach midei shana b'shana, every year, shana, like the word Rosh Hashanah, is the first of the year. Shana, shana tova, have a good year. So in the same way, shana b'shana, every year, he would go v'sovav beit el v'hagilgal v'hamitzpah. I discussed this also in a different context in our Sunday class. He did the circuit. So I won't go into the same detail again about the circuit, but he made it his business to go from city to city around the country, because in those days, people did not have airplanes, trains, cars. It was not so easy to go to where he was, let's say in the Mitzpah or Ramah. And so instead, he felt it was his responsibility to go from town to major cities every year, to the degree that people had certain major litigation matters that they felt their local judges were not capable of handling. He undertook to do that and to speak words of inspiration. There's certain great rabbis that would do that, like the deceased former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Lord Lord Jonathan Sacks. So Lord Jonathan Sacks, Chief Rabbi Sacks, would go around the world. Primarily his responsibility was to the Jews of the United Kingdom. He was their chief rabbi, but eventually he made Aliyah to live in it. He retired, moved to Israel, and devoted a good part of every year to traveling around the world to different cities, speaking in different cities. And then a year or two later, you would hear that Chief Rabbi Sacks will be back. And he's going to be in town for a weekend or something. And so Shmuel made the rounds every year. And he went from the city of Bethel. We talked about it on Sunday, again, how holy the city of Bethel was. It was the place where God had appeared to Jacob, Yaakov Avinu, and other things happened in Bethel. Gilgal Mitzpah. Mitzpah, we just talked about now, was the religious center of the time of Shmuel. V'shafat Yisrael kol hamakomot ha'eleh, and he judged in all those places. Again, from my personal experience as a litigator, for about 10, 12 years, I was a litigator. I worked as an attorney. Then I got out of it and I went on to be a law professor and returned to being a rabbi. First, I was a rabbi for 10, 12 years, but we had certain financial challenges. So I had to change course. And for me, it's a long story. I ended up as a lawyer. And after about 10, 12 years, an opportunity arose in my life to restore my dream and what I really wanted to do with my life, be a rabbi. So I moved away from being a lawyer. And during the years that I was an attorney, I argued cases before a number of judges. I was at a major law firm, and I didn't really do trial work. I wasn't the guy you see on TV with the jury and the dramatic thing where someone gets up in the back of the courtroom and says, "I admit it, I did it." I was more of the kind that would show up the stuff you don't see on TV, where you argue motions before a federal judge. And that's actually, since the stuff I specialized in, let me tell you, that's the most important stuff. It's really the stuff you never see. Most cases don't go to trial. Only on TV they go to trial. Most cases get negotiated into settlements based on what happens with the depositions and the motions. When one side sees that they're losing all the motions and the depositions aren't going well, then they talk settlement. Okay, I don't want to get into that too much, but here's my point. What I learned from firsthand experience, it might be intuitive, is that there are some really brilliant judges, especially in the federal system. And then there are some judges that are really not so smart. I mean, really not so smart. I wouldn't even ask them whether they think it's going to rain tomorrow. I mean, there were some, I was surprised in the beginning. I figured to be a judge, you got to know something. And there'd be judges that really, especially in the state court level, they just did it by their gut. And that's one of the reasons you file papers. Each side files a 10-page or 15-page argument with cases. You cite the cases, especially for the benefit of the less brilliant judges. So what they don't know, they could read and they could research it. Shmuel's job, so you might think, did he really have to go around the country? Yeah. There would be more complicated cases that the average judge just couldn't get his mind around. And so Shmuel had to go and do it. And that was the role he played. So he did it all his life. And he lived in Ramah. You've heard of maybe Camp Ramah. Conservative Judaism have a summer camp called Camp Ramah. Where does that come from? Nobody ever asks these questions. But that's actually where it comes from. Ramah. That's a place where Shmuel was based. So it's the place in the Bible. It's like important, but it's not as important in Jerusalem. So you're not going to call your Camp Jerusalem or Camp Hebron. No, Camp Ramah. V'sham shafaret Yisrael ve'vensham espech Hashem, and there he served as a judge and the leader of the Jewish nation. I'm going to get into chapter 8 and a lot more next week on that. I'm glad that came out right. If it were the one before, I'd be saying, I'm going to go into chapter 7. And the lawyer in me tries to avoid saying that. Okay. So we're going to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is the end of his career. Interestingly, and surprising, Shmuel lived only 52 years. Even in biblical times, that was not as long as the average life. Vayihika asher zaken Shmuel, vayasem et banav shoftim liYisrael. As he was getting older, and again, the rabbis ask, he died at 52. So this is happening, he's about 50, 51. How old could he look? How did he even know he was getting old? How did he even know at 50 or 51 his life was about to end? And I'm going to discuss that in our last minutes today. Vayasem et banav shoftim liYisrael. So he appointed his two sons, his Beno Bechor Yoel v'Shem Mishneh Aviyah. He had two sons, Yoel and Aviyah, and he named them judges. And they were based in Beersheba in the south. And they did not meet the same standard of leadership that he did. And we'll take it from there next week, but we still have 8 minutes. And I want to learn a Gemara with you. I want to do a little bit of Talmud from Masechet Tanit 5b. In the Talmud, Tractate Tanit, folio 5b, they discuss these words, Vayihika asher zaken Shmuel, and Shmuel got old. How did he know he was old? Again, we find out soon enough, he died at 52. But given that King David lived to 70, and that was not remarkable, well, life longevity was comparable to what we have nowadays. So how did he know to hand over leadership to his sons at age 50? The Amarli Rav Nachman Rabbi Yitzchak. So this rabbi had a conversation, because the Talmud very often is about dialogue between rabbis discussing parts of the Bible. My dichtiv, Vayihika asher zaken Shmuel, umisiv Shmuel kulei hai. What does it mean? And Shmuel was getting really old. Was he so old? I know Vladimir Chandler's here with us. His Hebrew is very good. I want to point out, Vladimir and anyone else with Hebrew, that the Aramaic word siv, you may notice it's like the Hebrew word saba, grandfather. Was Shmuel so old? He was only 52 years old. The Omar Mar, mate shana, as was taught, the rabbi known as Mar. Mar means the master. There was a rabbi who was so great in his generation They did not even refer to him by his name. They simply referred to him as the master. And he taught that Shmuel died at 52. Zehu mitato shel Shmuel haramati. Shmuel of Ramah died at 52. What's the deal? Why did he die so young? Omar le hachi Amar Rav Yochanan. So it was Rav Nachman who asked the question to Rabbi Yitzchak, and Rabbi Yitzchak responded to him, here's what was taught by Rabbi Yochanan. By the way, a very important principle in Judaism. Whenever you cite a teaching, you must cite the source. Not only in academia, to avoid charges of plagiarism, are you supposed to cite your source, but it is regarded as a matter of honoring. It's a fundamental honoring of a teacher. If you learn something from a teacher, you give credit for the rest of your life. I learned this from this teacher. Where'd you ever hear of that? I actually learned it from this teacher. Or not even to wait for them to say, where'd you ever hear of that? But if you say something, interesting, when it says in the Bible, X, Y, Z, did you know that? And by the way, I learned that from so-and-so. That's a requirement. It stems from Megillat Esther, the book of Esther, which we'll be learning about on Sundays, starting this Sunday, now that we're moving into Purim season. In the beginning of the book of Esther, there's a assassination plot by Bigtan and Teresh, two assistants to King Ahasuerus. And Mordechai the Jew overhears the assassination plot and tells his niece, Esther, the queen, about the assassination plot. She tells the king about the assassination plot, and she says, I heard about it from Mordechai the Jew. King does not know she's related to Mordechai. And they investigate, and they find out there really is that assassination plot, and Bigtan and Teresh are executed. And later in the story, we don't have time for it, it is because it was written in the diary of the king that Mordechai the Jew was the one who revealed the assassination plot. And the only way they know that is that Esther quoted Mordechai when she told her husband his assassination plot. That is what led to the saving of the Jewish people in that time in Persia, from which the rabbis learn you must always cite the person from whom you heard anything that's a teaching. So let's try to get this in really quickly in our last few minutes. So Rabbi Yitzchak answers Rabbi Nachman, who wants to know what's the deal with Samuel dying at 52. He says, I learned from Rabbi Yochanan, Zikna kofsa alav. He was 52 and overnight he turned into an old man. Dichtiv nichamti ki himlachti et Shaul. Overnight, his hair turned probably white. His voice may have changed. Overnight, he aged, let's say, 20 years. Not exactly 20. I'm making up the number, but just giving you an idea. And the reason is that, and I'll summarize what is about to be here because I don't like to run over the schedule time of class. We're going to learn in the next few weeks that one of the last things Prophet Shmuel did was God said to him, I want you to anoint the first king of Israel. And I will show you who it is. And he ends up anointing Shaul of Benjamin, King Saul. But unfortunately, and we'll learn this also in subsequent chapters, God later will say to him, Saul has done a wrong, and therefore Saul will not have a dynasty. I'm taking the dynasty from Shaul. His son Jonathan will not be the next king. Instead, it will go somewhere else to another family. And that's how King David emerges from the family of Yishai, Jesse, and the tribe of Yehuda, Judah. And we'll learn all of that. I should have said, spoiler alert, the Jews are going to have a king named David. Make believe you didn't hear it. So anyway, what ends up happening is that Shmuel, as a prophet, had a prophecy in advance. And he said to God, Moses was your prophet, and you never reversed anything you had him do as a prophet. And yet, with me, Shmuel, Samuel, you had me anoint Saul king of Israel. A king is dynastic, the implication that his son and beyond will be king. And now you're telling me to reverse it. You're telling me to take away the kingship from Saul and give it somewhere else. You never reversed the prophecy and an assignment you gave Moses, and you're reversing. Why are you reversing a prophecy you gave me? And the Talmud is going to explain that not so much as a punishment, but God responded by saying, it'll be reversed publicly after your death. Saul will lose the kingship, and David will arise to be king after your death. Secretly, the public won't know it. You will anoint David when that time needed to come. You will know, and I, God, will know, David is anointed as the new king. Saul's dynasty is destined to end. But you will die before it actually plays out publicly, so that you won't have the embarrassment of your action, your anointing Saul, being reversed in your lifetime. And so that's why he died at age 50. Moshe lived to 120. And so the Talmud discusses that. It's a very interesting Talmudic passage. And I'm going to close with that. Let's read it 1, 2, 3, because I've explained it fully. Rabbi Yitzchak said, Rabbi Yochanan said as follows: old age sprang upon Shmuel, which caused him to appear older than his actual age. Shmuel said, before God, Master of the universe, you've considered me the equivalent of Moshe and Aron. So just as with regard to Moshe and Aron, their handiwork was not annulled in their lifetimes, so too let my handiwork not be annulled in my lifetime. I anointed Saul. Please do not annul his reign. The Holy One, blessed is he. That's a name of God, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, said, what shall I do? I'm not going to have Saul die prematurely, and Samuel doesn't want it, and I don't want, so what am I going to do? So it goes on, and finally, again, I see it's a little longer than I expected, so I don't want to take you too far. I've explained it, but God decides on that basis that Shmuel would die at 52. So next week, as we get into chapters 8 and 9, maybe 10, but I see we're averaging about 2 chapters a week. When we get into chapter 8, we will see the beginnings of the end of Shmuel the prophet as ruler, as the